Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee and today I want to discuss the lay of the land. So a couple of weeks ago I put up a video after action report based on a game that I did of the Bass Raid. Now I originally played this as a demo game back in 2017, I think it was, at the Broadside show, and of course that time I was playing it as or I was running it as the umpire, and I never got a chance to play the actual game itself, so I decided I wanted to recreate it on my own tabletop and play it as a solo game, so I'd get a chance to move some figures around and blow stuff up. But there's two problems with that. One, first off, it's a solo game, so I needed to change the rules for that, which was fine, and did that. That seemed to work fairly well. But the other problem, which has created a train of thought that leads to this video, is that my table's smaller than the demo game that I was demo table we used back in 2017, and that in itself felt too small for the map that I wanted to fit onto it. So of course, when I did recreate it on this table, I had to twist and squeeze and move elements around in order to make it fit on the table. And of course that begs the question, if we're recreating a historical battle, what is more important, pinpoint accuracy in our maps, our tabletop layouts, or an interpretation of the terrain? So as I said, the original Bass layout that I did back in 2017 was already a compromise. What I did is I took some aerial photographs that were available from that time, and terrain maps, and I realised that there's a load of dead space, there's areas where nothing happened, so I cut them out and moved elements closer together to make them fit onto the table. And I chose that I wanted to do my battle to include some of the wider elements of the whole raid, so more of the approach and the escape, as well as the actual raid bit itself on the airfield. Now, I've seen this particular raid recreated in lots of different games, actually, in different scales, various blogs. I'll try and put some links in the comments bit below. Wargamers Illustrated did a version of it, and everyone interprets the game slightly differently. They want to look at a different aspect of it. I wanted that slightly wider view. Because I was doing it in 6mm, I felt I had the room to be able to do a slightly wider view where I saw the LRD GG approaching their target, and some of the action that took place on that approach, as well as the raid and then their escape. And I managed to fit that on that table because I cut out a lot of the dead space where nothing happened. But when I come to trying to put it on this table, I had even less space to do the game in. So I ended up sort of twisting and squeezing the map to get all the relevant elements onto the table. And I still felt it produced a really good game that sort of recreated the encounter. But of course, if you was to look down on my table, it doesn't look anything like the aerial photographs, the topography maps of the time, because I've moved some of the elements around. And for me, that worked because I decided that what was more important was those narrative elements in the game, those particular things that play, bits of terrain that made the story of the battle or the whole raid. So long as they had a relationship to each other, it didn't matter if they weren't quite in exactly the same configuration as the map. Now, some of you may not like that. That was my particular choice. I'd love to hear what you think about that. And of course, it has to be asked, did the game that I put on for my after action report last week, is it still a historical battle when I've changed the map? Now, what I would say is all of us make compromises with the map, even when we're trying to recreate a battle with all the right elements in all the right places, because most rule games rules will compromise with grand scale to start with. So you've already changed the reality of the surface that you're playing on, the area you're playing on, by shrinking down that ground scale so that those ranges for weapons still fit on the table, as opposed to shooting across the table and 20 feet that way. So we already make compromises when we run our games. So I don't think it's a huge leap to say, well, if the elements aren't quite in the same pattern they were originally, but they're all there on the table, then that's okay. So for instance, I would take, right, what are the main elements of the terrain that stand out from the historical map. So you might go, there was a hill here and another hill and a town and a river. And so long as those narrative elements, those bits where action takes place, are still on the table and there's a broad relationship between them, it doesn't matter too much whether they're in exactly the same position as they were. So long as they're, I wouldn't separate two hills and put other terrain in between if that wasn't the case. But I might change the configuration of those hills to fit that map, if you like, onto my tabletop. And we need to make these compromises if we're going to fit most of our games. As I've already said, we change ground scales to fit armies and battles onto the table. So sometimes we're going to need to move elements around. That hill, for instance, might be an important narrative element to the story. The hill on which the commander stood during the battle, or a particular fight was taking place on. You need to keep that terrain element on the table. It just doesn't necessarily need to be in this particular pattern. And that's exactly what I've done with the Barsh Raid. I twisted it so that all of the elements that I wanted to feature in the game, so the escarpment, the town itself and the railway line that came across it, the telegraph poles running down all the roads, and of course the airfield itself, all of those elements were on the table, squeezed a little bit so that they would fit into my smaller than normal table, but they still produced a story. When I played the game, it played out very historically. Now obviously when we play our games, the actions of the opposing player and the randomness of the dice can change history, but my particular game played out fairly historically. There were changes, there were differences, but it played out historically, and for me it meant that despite moving those terrain elements and twisting the map to fit on, I still got a realistic game. Now it's not a simulation by any means, but it was a realistic analogue of what happened on that night in 1942. Now of course you may completely disagree with me. You may say, no, you've just moved into the realms of fantasy there, Lee, and I totally understand, and to be honest, a bit of me wants to agree with you. But we, as I said earlier, we have to make compromises when we lay out our tables, and certainly I do on a smaller table than normal, even when I'm using 6mm to get more distance out of me wargaming figures. So I'd love to hear what you do. Do you agree with me? Do you think that so long as you keep those narrative elements of the story on the table, those important terrain elements, it doesn't matter too much if their relationship is slightly different to fit all those elements onto the table? Because let's face it, ancient armies, or indeed modern armies, don't fight in a nice neat rectangle. The battlefields are odd shapes, and somehow we need to squeeze that into our rectangular shaped tables, unless you're really lucky and you've got massive space and multiple tables, and most of us don't do that. Maybe at demos and if you've got a lot of money, and most of us certainly haven't. So I'd love to know what you think. What compromises have you had to make? Do you agree with me? Is it still historical, or have I slipped into fantasy? So I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, and of course over on my blog, Big Lee's Miniature Adventures. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. So until next week, as always, please keep safe, get as many games in as you can, and of course keep rolling high.